All right, thanks so much for being with us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Lim Nakrin, joined here by attorney J. Edward Shipp. Thank you so much for being with us.
No problem.
So, we want to continue our coverage now of the investigation into the former president, Donald Trump, and the impending indictment. Well, I should say, potential impending indictment here in
Yes.
Fulton County.
Right.
But obviously, we've been talking about the situation around the Fulton County Courthouse, where their Prior Street Southwest is closed, and there are barricades up around the courthouse. So this and numerous court employees have been sent home to work from home in anticipation of these potential indictments. So most legal analysts agree that, look, you don't do all this for nothing, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So something that we've been talking about with Mr. Shipp here, joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus, is when this could potentially happen. And we got this new information that that actually, you know, well, that may help us kind of anticipate when we could potentially get the indictments. The word seems to be that it's going to happen next week, and that has to do with the lack of notice given to certain witnesses. For instance, Jordan, and Jeff Duncan, we understand, have not received notice to appear before the grand jury, and they should be given 48 hours notice. Which would then put us, early next week if they get that notice. Is that right, Mr. Shipp? I mean, how would you break down the timing?
Yeah, so as soon as they get noticed, they come in, they do their testimony, and based on the magnitude of this indictment or potential indictment, I'm pretty sure the charging documents have been typed up. They're sitting, they're waiting for their final tweak. It could possibly be a day or so after they give their final testimony, and we could see an indictment come down from District Attorney Willis's office at that time.
Yeah, something we're watching so closely. But we're also talking about who could potentially be indicted here. That's something else that we're keeping an eye on. And we know that the federal indictment, which we covered together, which actually dropped on the first day of August, or was filed the first day of August. There's a whole section that we've been going through before we actually came onto the stream. So I've highlighted
Right,
it, marked it up, and everything. You and I were just sitting there going through it and
right,
looking at this whole section on Georgia, which was, I think it was pages 12 to 16. So it's like 5 pages, all about Georgia, all about activities that took place here in the state of Georgia that gave rise to those federal indictments. And then there's a lot of talk about, various co-conspirators, basically co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 2, co-conspirator 3, who we were working to kind of figure out who
right,
is who.
right,
So
right.
will you let viewers into that conversation a little bit, what we were talking about.
So what we've pretty much come up with is co-conspirator one. We all believe that that would be Rudy Giuliani, who came in and made the statements that there was extreme voter fraud going on, that people were handing out USB drives that could change votes, things of this nature. And I mean, he's already dealing with a civil suit in Atlanta based on those statements, in which he has pretty much admitted that those statements were false, or at least stipulated to that. We were also looking at Sidney Powell being one of those co-conspirators. She is the individual who came up with these baseless accusations that the Dominion voting machines were changing votes from Trump to Biden. And, she actually sued the governor of Georgia alleging massive voter fraud. So you got those two. And then we got this John Eastman who comes in, and he's kind of saying that, we could possibly uh, have a second slate of electors, and then make the argument that since there are no valid electors, we can't certify this election, and therefore Trump should be reelected. And those are, those are massive things to try and come up with. But hey, this is all could lend to a conspiracy that possibly District Attorney Willis is looking into.
And so while you were talking, I was pulling up our section on the key figures, because we have, honestly, I have to give a lot of credit to our digital team, because let me back out a little bit just to show people how to get to this. But if you check out our homepage, I mean, you'll see that there is a whole section on the Trump investigations. And again, I keep emphasizing it's plural, because there are now 3 indictments against the former president, and potentially a 4th one right here in the state of Georgia. So we have this tab called Trump Investigation, but it's numerous investigations. And there's so much here, you know, the key figures, the timeline. Let me take off that graphic so you can see it better. See the key figures, the timeline, the grand jurors, all of it. And then if you look right here, you see where I have my cursor, you can listen to that phone call. The call that started it all. This is really good listening content if you want something really juicy to listen to. And this is where, on January 2nd of 2021, the former president calls our Secretary of State here in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, you know, and talks about the votes that have been counted, and how he essentially believes, and he's being advised, that there was some sort of voting fraud going on, and essentially says to the Secretary of State, hey, you need to find me 11,700 some votes, and you know, because I definitely won. It's
Right.
just, you know, you guys have messed up with your voting counting and all this stuff, and all these pieces of it. You know, when we were looking through, we were actually a little bit entertained, right? You and I were
Right.
talking about how, you know, according to the federal indictment, which I'm reading right here, the defendant claimed 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia, to which Brad Raffensperger, according to this federal indictment, responded, well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were 2.
Right.
Two people that were dead actually voted. So, you know, that call is worth listening to. But based on that, what we see in the federal indictment, I mean, that's based on what happened here in Georgia. So what could we see in terms of state charges for that?
You know, we are definitely probably looking at, the more I think about it, we're probably looking at a RICO charge for all the individuals involved in this. I mean, it comes from the top down. If you're looking at it as a prosecutor, you have former President Trump, who is pushing to overturn an election by saying you need to find 11,780 votes. You have Rudy Giuliani, who comes in and comes with this idea, and even comes to the Capitol to try and persuade individuals that, you know, there was massive fraud going on at the State Farm Arena during ballot counting. You have Sidney Powell, who was working for Donald Trump, who, you know, alleged this massive voter fraud in the state of Georgia. You also have, you know, John Eastman, who was trying to get these individuals to have a sort of slate of fake electors. And, you know, this was uncovered by a local journalist who just happened to walk in and start taking pictures and blowing their cover. So, you know, there is a very high probability that, you know, District Attorney Willis will be coming with RICO charges for all the individuals involved, including things such as obstruction of justice, conspiracy. You know, the list just goes on.
Yeah, and you know, I've kind of been using this federal indictment as a roadmap for, you know, what I think maybe we could see here in Georgia. And I don't know. I mean, it's anybody's guess, right? But
Right.
that's why we have you here and why we're having this discussion. But you mentioned the what was happening at State Farm Arena, where Rudy Giuliani. We're assuming it's Rudy Giuliani, but that's what analysts are assuming, that is the person referred to as co-conspirator number 1 and the defendant in this indictment, the federal indictment, you know, where they played this misleading excerpt of a video recording a ballot counting at State Farm Arena, insinuating that it showed election workers counting suitcases of illegal ballots. So, that's why Georgia is so important in the federal indictments. And then when we see the indictments come down here, I mean, this is big, potentially very big and historic news coming out of Fulton County, Georgia, right here.
It's amazing that this will be in the history books, hopefully for years to come. We're watching a historic moment just unfold in real time. You have a former president who, if he was to win, would not be able to pardon himself on these state charges, nor could he get a governor to pardon him on these state charges. So we're basically looking at a situation in which a president-elect, if he is elected in November, could possibly be, standing trial for trying to overturn the election in which he lost. So, this is massive. This is on a historic scale, never before seen. And, I hope all the viewers are paying attention to all of this, because this will be something to tell your grandkids about.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to ask you about also is just the fact that, there's going to be so much publicity here in Georgia as compared to any of these other cases, because we've talked about the fact there are already 3 indictments against the former president. This potentially could be the 4th one, but 2 of those indictments are in federal courts. So you got the indictment most recently out of Washington, D.C., and this is again based on the alleged interference in the 2020 election. But those are federal indictments. Those are 4 federal counts, and no cameras allowed in federal court. The thing in Florida, that's about the alleged mishandling of classified documents. There's 40 federal counts. Federal, again, you're talking about federal courts. So there are not going to be cameras there. And then you got the case up in New York with the alleged hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. It seems that in state courts in New York, it's kind of case by case as to whether cameras are allowed. Maybe you know something about that. But here in Georgia, historically it's fairly camera friendly. What do you think?
Yeah, I think a motion will be filed to actually be able to record during these proceedings, just because of the historic nature of it. Everybody kind of wants to see what's going on. And in a situation like this, I believe it was said sunlight is the best disinfectant. So, you don't want to have a
Justice
situation.
Brandeis.
Exactly. You don't want to have a situation in which people can allege, you're doing some shady things in the courtroom behind these closed doors. If you televise it and publicize it and allow everybody to see what is actually going on, it actually gives more of his supporters and his critics a chance to say, okay, well, hey, this is what's actually happening. Some may understand the, things that are going on, but that's what you have people like us for, that can come in and kind of explain, all the legal maneuvers that are being done at that time.
So I want to ask you, Jay, when we've talked about this a little bit, like the federal counts that we saw. I know you can't see this, but conspiracy to defraud the U.S., conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, conspiracy against rights. So you've got 3 different conspiracy type charges, 1 obstruction and an attempted obstruction charge. Here, if and when this local indictment comes down in Fulton County, safe to say there's a couple conspiracy counts that we'd be looking at?
Yeah, they're safe to say that. And then if they do go with the RICO statute, all they have to do is show a pattern of racketeering activity, and they just need 2 or more events to show that under, I can't remember which part of the statute it is off the top of my head at this point, but, they just need to show that pattern of racketeering activity. And some of these acts that we have actually heard with our own ears in the phone call could be classified as racketeering activity. So, you got a situation in which he's trying to give a false statement to a government agent. That is actually an act of racketeering activity. And, adding that to trying to get these fake electors to come in and, be almost like a red herring to keep from certifying all the electors for Georgia, we're looking at those two acts right there that could, definitely find former President Trump charged under the RICO statute in Georgia.
That is interesting. So if we're talking about now looking at these potential counts that we could see, so we're talking about a couple conspiracy counts, we're talking about potential RICO charges. What else could we see?
Oh man, we don't know. That's the crazy thing, because there is so much that is probably being uncovered at this time. There's probably testimony that was given that was, contradicting at times. We may see some perjury charges because these people were sworn in to give,
that's a good point.
truthful testimony. So, we may see a lot of surprising
Actually,
things.
you're the first person I've heard point out the possibility for a perjury charge, but that's a really excellent point.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those situations where we kind of have to sit back and kind of see what type of web they weave for themselves, because I'm almost certain that there are going to be some instances in which there is conflicting testimony about certain events, and we'll just see how it plays out for the district attorney's office at that time.
Yeah. What about for false statements? What kind of...
So, going back even to the excerpt that was in the federal indictment, there was a genuine belief that there were 5,000 dead people who voted, and this had been advanced not only with former Secretary of State. This has been advanced throughout the whole, situation, that you had all these dead people voting. These people had their votes counted incorrectly. There were USB ports, even though he's supposed to be saying jump drives, passed around, things of that nature. All of these false statements were given to a government agency, and now we're seeing that it's coming back to bite them. I think, in my opinion, if they would have just, taken the loss and tried to regroup, it would be better for them. But that's why I'm not a political analyst. I'm just a legal analyst.
Don't say just. It's very important. It's very important. But, it is interesting because, when you go back and read this federal indictment, it does talk about, I'm going to read the language. The defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function through dishonesty, fraud, and deceit included, following manner and means, and goes into the defendant allegedly using, I need to say allegedly with all this, this is what the indictment says, the defendant allegedly using false claims. So even in the federal indictments, we are talking about false statements, but yet the charges are conspiracy charges as it relates to these false statements. It's conspiracy to defraud the U.S., it's conspiracy to obstruct, conspiracy against rights, and then you have the obstruction count as well. There's not a per se count, of like false statements or fraud.
Right.
So why?
So it's all, when you look at a conspiracy, you're looking at more than just one person coming up with this plan of what they're going to try to do. And what we have seen here in the federal indictment and here in Georgia is that there were multiple people involved in this who, came together to form a conspiracy. And that's exactly what we're witnessing. We have allegedly Rudy Giuliani visiting the Georgia Capitol. We have John Eastman coming with him to try to advance his case. We have Sidney Powell, who allegedly came and even went as far as to sue the governor of Georgia. You have all these things coming together, and their whole idea, their whole, I guess, the best way to put it is their whole plan was to overturn this election by coming up with these false statements. So this is why it's charged as a conspiracy, because if you go in and say, okay, well, they gave these false statements, you have to have that burden of proof of saying that they knew that the statements were false. Now, one could argue that Rudy Giuliani has already admitted to knowing that his statements were false in his previous court filing in a civil suit by at least stipulating that, you know, these statements were false, defamatory, etc. But as far as proving it at the time, the prosecutor would have to prove, hey, they knew without a doubt that these statements were false, and their lawyers could very well argue, hey, they really thought that, you know, dead people had voted, that, you know, there was a massive conspiracy going on. This is why they tried to advance their agenda.
Well, here's my question to you though: is if they're arguing like with the federal indictment, and this is kind of going backwards because we've gone through the federal indictment, we're looking forward, but like with the federal indictment, why do we see conspiracy to defraud the U.S. Yes, but we could have also seen some kind of charge related to the false alleged false statements themselves, not just conspiracy to do so, right? It's like that's the nature of a conspiracy charge. It's like, you know, if you and I conspire to kill somebody, right, we're going to be charged with murder and conspiracy, right? Is that true?
So we would only be charged with murder if we went through with the whole.
Oh well, yes,
yeah,
I should say that. We could say let's pretend that
Right.
you and me conspired to kill somebody, and then we actually killed somebody. Then we're
so,
going to be
yeah.
charged with both, right?
Right. So
Murder and
you know,
conspiracy.
I believe what it all goes back to the state of mind at the time. The feds, as we've already said on this program numerous of times, is that they make sure that their case is airtight and they don't want to have any outs for the defendant when they prosecute. So the defendant could use the out that I thought or I was under the impression that when I made these statements, they were true to me and my beliefs. And they could say, okay, well, you know, it wasn't a false statement. It was just what I believed to be true at the time.
Okay.
They're not giving them that out by saying, okay, well, you did a conspiracy and you used these things that should have been known to be false by any reasonable person, and, you know, you had a plan to overthrow the government. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think that's what they're using. That's why they're not giving them a false statement charge in the federal indictment.
Okay. I know we've had you up here for a while, and I don't want to keep you all day, but I do want to ask you about.
I don't mind being here. I like being here.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. Well, just about who we could see indicted here in Georgia. You know, we talked about some of the electors.
Yes.
Some of the electors have reached plea deals, is my understanding.
Yes.
There were 16 electors implicated, I believe, but majority of them,
Majority took a plea deal.
Deals, I believe.
Yeah, and we're probably looking at about 7 more that are left. Those didn't take a plea deal. They could be indicted. We're probably looking at an indictment for former President Trump. We're most likely looking at an indictment for Rudy Giuliani. We could be looking at an indictment for Sidney Powell. We could be looking at an indictment for John Eastman. We could also be looking at an indictment, sort of a dark horse of sorts, as the Coffee County GOP commissioner or administrator who actually allowed them to go in and breach the voting systems. And even though it's in Coffee County, they used that information to further their agenda in trying to get this done. So, you know, that person could be brought up on charges in Fulton County for attempting to overthrow this election.
And so I want to ask you the basis for with the electors. I think that's pretty obvious. You know, what would be the basis for I just want to clarify with everybody. What would be the basis for the indictments here in Georgia for the electors? I think that's obvious. These are alleged fake electors.
Right.
But, you know, for Sidney Powell, is it because of filing the lawsuit, falsely alleging the massive election fraud? Would that be the basis for her indictment?
I don't necessarily think her lawsuit would be the basis. I think it would be her statements and her advancing this agenda, advancing the whole conspiracy by filing the lawsuit. I'm pretty sure that, you know, if it was to be taken and isolated, you know, everybody has a right to file a lawsuit for what they believe in. Here we have a situation in which there was a plan to try to overthrow the results of the Georgia election in which President Joe Biden won Georgia, and part of that plan was for her to sue the governor of Georgia. So she acted as an agent of the top conspirator, who many are alleging to be former President Trump, and therefore that's how she's getting caught up in this.
And then with Rudy Giuliani, the alleged activity here in Georgia is allegedly orchestrating a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate, allegedly trying to mislead these state senators, and falsely claiming that there was 10,000 dead people voting in Georgia, and showing this misleading video excerpt, showing, this alleged, what they claim is stuffing suitcases with illegal ballots, or counting suitcases of illegal ballots, I should say. So that's kind of the basis for his, would be the basis for his indictments going forward in Georgia, right? Am I missing something else?
Right. I believe it was around maybe January, February. I'm not too good on the details at this time, but he did visit the Capitol. He did give that presentation. He did try to advance this idea that all of this massive voter fraud was going on during the ballot counting process. And yeah, that's probably what he's going to be held culpable for.
So I want to ask you then, and I'm just trying to sort this out also by looking at the federal indictment, because co-conspirator 2, that would be John Eastman, another attorney involved. That's when he allegedly encouraged the legislators here in Georgia to decertify the state's legitimate electors based on these false allegations of election fraud. Is there something else that John Eastman is accused of doing with respect to Georgia that would, give rise to indictments here?
Not off the top of my head, not that I can think of at this time, but the idea that, he tried to get this fake slate of electors is massive in itself.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, going and actually going against the will of the people who duly elected President Joe Biden, and saying, hey, we're going to put up these fake electors, and now nobody can, kind of figure out who is who. That's massive. That just goes to show, how much planning and how much was kind of invested in trying to get President Trump to have his loss overturned.
So appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise and analysis. Can you let people know if they need a good lawyer, who to call, how to get in touch with you?
Hey, you can follow me on IG, Shipp Law. That's letter J, SHIPP LAW. You can find me on Facebook, JAMARA, Shipp, SHIPP. Easy to find, ready to work, whatever you need.
Well, don't you need to say hi to your mom?
Hi, Mom. Hi, wife. Hi, dog and kids.
I know they're watching.
Right.
Thank you so much. Hey, just a reminder for our viewers, we have this whole section on our website on the Trump investigations. And, it's a lot to follow. So you see we have the key figures, the timeline, the grand jurors. And if you guys have a little bit of confusion, because there's a lot going on here, I would encourage you to check out AtlantaNewsFirst.com and look on the Trump tab, the Trump investigation tab. You click right there. That's where it lands you, right? And then you see all these wonderful articles that our team has put together, help you figure out what all this is about. But again, the potential indictment is expected now next week against the former president and his alleged allies or co-conspirators. So we're going to keep an eye on that. Keep it right here on Atlanta News First, AtlantaNewsFirst.com, and Atlanta News First Plus for all the latest. Thank you and have a great day.